Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're going to make sure that our recordings are all set. Okay, thank you for bearing with us, and hello, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us today for our hour-long training on collecting qualitative data in your community. So I'm Bridget Courteau, the Director of Group Learning for the Learning Community, and also one of your facilitators today. And on behalf of our team at the Urban Institute, thanks again for being with us. So first, I'm going to do my typical brief review of the features and requests for this meeting. Next slide, please. So please remain on mute unless you're speaking so that we can avoid any accidental disruptions. We are providing live interpretation into Spanish this afternoon. If you'd like to listen to the Spanish channel, select that option in the Zoom taskbar by clicking the globe icon. And I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourself over the chat and tell us which organization you're from. This is nice for getting to know one another, but it's also a way that we double check our attendance for performance reporting. So we really appreciate your help with this. And you should also use chat to send us any questions that you have throughout the presentations. We've allotted some time near the end of the hour for Q&A, but I encourage you to chat your questions as they come up, since we may be able to incorporate them earlier. And we'll also be sharing some links to materials over the chat, so be on the lookout for those. Speaking of materials, the slides and the recordings from this session will be available after the fact on our PAVE Learning Community website, as well as circulated through the CDC's Adult Vax Program listserv. And finally, as always, if you have any technical difficulties, we want to know about them. Please send us a note to our Group Learning Manager inbox, which is here on the screen, but it's also vaxequitylearning@urban.org. Next slide. So we have a lot to share with you today. I'm going to try to keep our introductions brief. You know me as the Group Learning Manager for the Learning Community, of course, but I am also a Principal Research Associate in Urban Institute's Health Policy Center. And I have nearly two decades of experience conducting policy research and analysis, and I specialize in qualitative data collection methods. I've worked on qualitative research projects related to Medicaid and other public health insurance programs, maternal and child health, reproductive health, and the healthcare safety net. And currently, I'm co-lead for qualitative data collection for the national evaluation of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, also called CMMI, for their maternal opioid misuse demonstration program. And it's my pleasure to also introduce my colleague of many years, Ian Hill. Ian is a senior fellow in Urban's Health Policy Center, and some of you may know him for the role that he plays in our learning community as senior coordinator for one of our communities of practice, and also as director of the Promising Practices Initiative through the learning community. Ian has more than 25 years of experience directing evaluation and TA projects on health programs for families and children. And he's nationally recognized as a qualitative researcher with extensive experience developing case studies of health program implementation and conducting focus groups with healthcare consumers, with providers, and with administrators. Ian's currently directing Urban's work on the maternal opioid misuse or MOM evaluation that I mentioned just a moment ago, and he's also the newly named chair of Urban's Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Next slide, please. Since we are going to cover a lot of ground today, a quick review of our agenda could be helpful at this point. So first, we're going to do some level setting on qualitative data and the role that it plays. Then we'll go into a deeper dive on 3 core qualitative data collection methods. And after some summary remarks, we're hoping to have enough time for discussion and an activity using Zoom Whiteboard, which we're eager to try out in a learning session. Next slide. All right, so to get started, let's review some basic points about qualitative data collection and why and how you'd want to use it. So what is qualitative data? Some key features of this type of data are that it's descriptive, conceptual, and it's generally expressed in a narrative form to tell a story, answer a research question, or other issue that you're investigating. You might contrast qualitative data with its counterpart, quantitative data. Quantitative data is numeric in form. And these 2 types of data, numbers and the story behind them, can be especially powerful together. So why would someone want to use qualitative data in the first place? Well, it allows us to explore ideas by gathering detailed information directly from individuals who have firsthand experience. And it's particularly helpful in answering questions about why or how something happens, questions that often can't be answered by looking just at numbers. It helps us think through complicated systems and figure out how things are working on the ground in real life. And some of the most common uses of qualitative data are for evaluating programs and policies and improving them. You might also be familiar with the role of qualitative data in market research. So some companies use it to improve customer experience and figure out what their target audience wants or needs. Next slide. How are qualitative data collected? Well, there's several different ways to collect this type of data, but today we're going to focus on 3 core approaches, which include interviews with key stakeholders, focus groups with people that have lived experience with the topic or issue that you're investigating, and observations of settings or processes and interactions. When you're beginning your journey into qualitative data collection, your first step should be to define your research question. And this will guide the rest of your decision-making about methods. So if you start with a solid question, and then you can consider the types of information that you need to answer it, and who can provide you with that information. So one example, a question might be that some of our PAVE members might be interested in is, why are some vaccine clinics that your program is hosting very successful with a lot of participants and others have few participants? So to answer that question, you could collect information from the people in your community who you're targeting with your clinics, ideally from people who are going to your clinics and the people who are not. And you could also collect information from vaccine providers and program staff that are working to host the clinics. And any of the methods that are kind of listed here and that we'll discuss in a moment could be applied to answer this illustrative question. Next slide, please. Anyone who's considering qualitative data collection must also consider human subjects protections. Before beginning your data collection, you might need to get your methods reviewed and approved by something called an IRB or Institutional Review Board. For those who aren't very familiar with this term, an IRB is an entity that does an independent review of research studies with the goal of helping to make sure that they meet ethical standards and that they protect the privacy and the rights of the people who participate in the research. Getting IRB review and approval could be the topic of an entire learning session. We don't have much time to go into depth about this right now, but I'm going to quickly cover some basics that may help your team decide whether qualitative data collection activities that you're interested in need to be reviewed by an IRB. So first, it's important to know that there are federal regulations that require all research projects that involve human subjects to be reviewed and approved by an IRB. The federal definition of research is here on the slide. This comes directly from the common rule that regulates this sort of thing. And so that definition is research is a systematic investigation that is designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And that last piece, generalizable knowledge, is really key. Human subjects are defined as living individuals that interact with an investigator to provide data, which may include identifiable private information. And special federal rules apply to research that involves what are termed as vulnerable populations. So these are groups that may be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. It includes children or incarcerated people as examples. So you probably don't need IRB approval if you're doing a project not designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So for instance, a quality improvement project where you're trying to enhance a specific program that you're running, or an assessment of how something's working in a single setting or community without any goal of comparing it to other settings or sort of adding to the general knowledge base. And at the end of the day, the most important thing that you should take away here is that you might need IRB approval. It's something that you should consider as you are creating your research project and designing it. And plan ahead for it if you determine that you do need it, because it does require additional work to prepare an IRB package. It will add to your timeline to do that review, and there may be some costs implied if you don't have an in-house IRB. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is it for the groundwork. And now we're going to talk about methods in just a moment. But before we do that, we'd really like to gauge the audience experience with qualitative data collection. And so if you wouldn't mind taking a moment now to participate in the poll that's going to pop up in front of you, tell us which of these qualitative data collection methods you've been involved with as a researcher or as a human subject. So either one of those, let us know. And you can select all that apply on this poll. So we're going to give that a moment, and then we will publish the results. Okay, Sophia, are you able to show us? All right,
Yes,
so
can you see the shared results?
I can see them on my other screen, but do you want to read? Do you want to like summarize them for us?
Yeah,
They're
sure.
not showing up on my host screen.
No worries. So I see that 47% of participants answered that they've been a part of a stakeholder interview. 82% shared that they've been either organized or have participated in focus groups. 29% indicated observations, 24% indicated other type of qualitative data collection, and 6% chose none.
Excellent. Thanks all for participating in that. And so it looks like there is a lot of experience here. Of course, we don't know if that's as an investigator or someone who is a participant, but either way, there's a lot of experience in this crowd, especially with interviews and focus groups. And so we also welcome in chat, if you have experience with some of these methods and want to add your own tips, go right ahead as Ian's talking through them. So there's always more to learn on how to do some of these methods well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ian, who's going to start taking us through the core methods.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bridget, and welcome everyone. It's great to see such strong attendance, and also to see how experienced you are with these methods. So Bridget took the words out of my mouth. We'll hopefully be able to augment your knowledge base in this area, but I'm sure you've got a lot of good stuff to share with us as well. So feel free to jump in, offer alternative opinions and ideas and tips. Okay, so I'll be going through the two of the core methods that we're discussing today. Stakeholder interviews first, also known as key informant interviews, and then focus groups second. Let's start with the interviews, as you can see here, and talk a little bit about when it's a good idea to conduct stakeholder interviews. And I think Bridget's example early on was a really good one, thinking about an evaluation of a vaccine equity program or attendance at vaccine events. Essentially, I think you want to conduct interviews when you want to learn how a program or an initiative was planned, when you want to learn how it was implemented, when you want to learn what kinds of challenges were encountered, as well as what successes were achieved. and then what lessons were learned by the people running the program along the way. Discussions like this are fairly in-depth. They involve asking a number of questions that may generate longer, more detailed responses. So an interview is really the best way to go about gathering information or qualitative data in this situation. Interviews are also appropriate when a topic is sensitive or private, so that the stakeholder or key informant that you're talking to might prefer a one-on-one conversation instead of meeting in a group. And then following on that, interviews are best when group interaction is just not a priority, when you're interested in gaining individual perspectives from a range of people rather than having a group share perspectives broadly. It is important to note that interviews take time, especially if you plan to do several of them, and there'll be more on that in a minute. So they are also more resource intensive than other qualitative methods. But on the plus side, interviews as a research method have an advantage of being flexible. You can schedule your interviews when it's mutually convenient for both you and the stakeholder that you want to talk to. So the next slide, please. Developing your interview protocol. The key to consistent, systematic data collection is a high-quality interview protocol. Interview protocol is the official term. Some of you might call it a discussion guide or semi-structured interview guide or even a questionnaire. But I'll keep calling it a protocol because that's what I've done for 30 years. But the purpose of the protocol is to enable you to ask the same questions in the same order for everyone you interview. It's especially important if you have a team of researchers or interviewers going out to work independently so that everyone collects information in the same way. Now, for the protocol itself, the content will need to include the things you see here on this page. You'll want to have an introductory section to your protocol that tells your stakeholders who you are, why you're conducting the interview, and how the information that you gather will be used. It will also need to include a section designed to obtain informed consent. That's the official word. It relates to the IRB slide that Bridget was talking to a moment ago. In this section, you're going to want to acknowledge to the people you're talking to the benefits of their participation. For example, like helping an evaluator better understand your program and maybe lead to program improvements. You want to identify potential risks to their participation, like even though we won't identify you by name, someone might be able to figure out who's saying what. And you also want to outline the steps that you'll be taking to protect people's confidentiality. Once you've explained those terms, you ask whether people are comfortable participating and you obtain that consent or you don't. If you don't, the interview ends, but if you do, then you proceed. So then, obviously, the biggest part of the protocol is the questions themselves. You'll want to develop a set of questions that flow in a logical, intuitive, and comfortable order. For example, in studying a program, you'll want to ask questions perhaps in the organization that I show you here in the middle bullet. You'll want to learn about the interviewee and their background. You want to learn how this initiative or program was planned and designed and why. Then you'll get into the nuts and bolts of implementation, what worked, what didn't, what challenges came up, how'd you get over them, and then wrapping up with some lessons learned, key takeaways. That's kind of a typical order of questions, but something you can kind of think through on your own. All of the questions should stem from your core research questions and the various sub-research questions that you want to learn about. Again, how is a program designed? How did people find out about it? How do people enroll in it? Where do people find services, et cetera? The key is to develop questions that are open-ended, not questions that can be answered with a yes or no answer. Again, you want to engage and draw people out. It's also important to ask questions in a neutral manner and one that is not leading. For example, you would not want to ask a question, did you have trouble scheduling your vaccine appointment? Instead, you'd want to ask, what was your experience scheduling your vaccine appointments? Again, you don't want to bias the responses by leading someone down a certain direction. The length of your protocol can vary. Depends on the study, depends on the stakeholder. Interviews can be short, 30 minutes. They can be long, 90 minutes. 60 minutes is usually a good target. And a decent rule of thumb is to ask about half as many questions as you have minutes for. So in other words, 15 questions for a 30-minute interview. I'm guilty of developing very long protocols. And in that case, a best practice is to bold and highlight the highest priority questions that you want to be sure everyone asks. Okay, so things to consider when you're planning interviews. On the next slide, please. One question is, how many interviews do you want or need to conduct? That's a decision that's driven by how many stakeholder perspectives you need to obtain. Another question is, what kinds of key informants or stakeholders do you need to talk to? The goal is to obtain multiple perspectives on a given project. You might want to talk to the people who fund the program, the people who design and administer it, the providers that participate, the community partners that are also affiliated with the effort. How long should each interview be? We talked about that just a moment ago. They can be short, medium, or long, depending on the role of the stakeholder you're speaking with. What language will be used? If not English or whatever your primary language is, you may need to consider setting aside resources for a translator or an interpreter, or hiring an interviewer who speaks the language you need. And then finally, this was not something we thought about so much 4 years ago, but you'll need to think about how and where the interview will take place. If it's in person, you'll want to conduct the interview in a private space that is convenient for the interviewee. If it's virtual, you'll need to make sure that the interviewee has the technical equipment and capacity to participate. Okay, so on to the next slide. You've got your protocol, you've scheduled your interviews, and now you're ready to conduct them. It's a very exciting moment in the research process when you're about to implement the data collection that you've been planning so carefully. It's at that moment that you really need to think about how you're going to conduct those interviews and what techniques you want to use to obtain the best, the richest information possible from your stakeholders. So here are some tips that I always share and encourage my team members to use. You want to study your protocol inside and out. Especially true if you weren't the one who designed the protocol, right? The person designing the protocol already pretty well knows it inside and out. But if you've been handed a protocol designed by someone else, study it, study it, study it. The more familiar you are with what it includes, the better you'll be at asking questions. And the more flexible you'll be if you get flustered and things start going out of order. We'll get to that in a moment. A second tip is to be disciplined. To follow the protocol. The protocol is your friend. If you do get lost, if you do get flustered, you have a document in front of you that tells you the order of the questions you're supposed to ask. So use it for the purpose it was intended. Now, I know I just said to be disciplined, but it is important to also maintain a degree of flexibility when you're conducting an interview. Sometimes you might ask a question and somebody will go off and start talking. It's okay to allow those stakeholders some leeway, to allow them to keep talking, as long as the information that they're providing is something you need to hear. It might be stuff that you would ask about later in the protocol, but if they're on a roll and it's good stuff, let them go. However, you'll also need to be ready to jump in, to rein them in if they're getting too far afield, if they're sharing a bunch of information that is not part of your protocol, okay? So some nice balance between discipline and flexibility is a sweet spot to hit. Again, you'll want to ask questions in a clear, crisp manner. You don't want to ask compound questions with multiple questions embedded in one another. And then another good tip is to use transitions as you move from one section of the protocol to the next. Okay, so we just finished talking about outreach. I'm now going to turn to the topic of service delivery. You want to let the person know where you've been and where you're going. It'll make them comfortable. It'll make you comfortable as you make progress through the interview. Okay, next, some more techniques to consider. Be an active listener. That is, you want to pay close attention to the answers to your questions. You're always trying to anticipate the next question that you need to ask, but it's important to listen to the one that's being answered. Again, knowing your protocol well will make you better at that. Make eye contact, nod your head to indicate that you understand what people are saying. You want to prove that you're listening to your stakeholder by reflecting answers that they give you to make sure that you're understanding a complex issue. You can use phrases like, what I hear you saying is such and such. Is that right? It's also a way for people to set you straight if you're not hearing it quite the right way. All right. It's important to also not be afraid of silence. Sometimes you'll ask a question and the stakeholder will be gathering their thoughts, formulating an answer. Nobody likes silences, but don't try to fill it yourself. Let them fill it. It's a hard skill to develop. It'll be even more important in focus groups, but I'll make a note of it now. It's important to manage your time carefully so that you don't run over. Watch the clock, try to get through all your questions within the time allotted. And finally, always have a backup plan in case something happens, in case somebody gets caught in traffic, in case you need a team member to take over at some point. Okay, so those are the tips and the comments that I had for stakeholder interviews. Bridget, were there any questions that came up in the chat that we want to address? No?
Not yet, but another encouragement to send those as they come, or any other tips you all have on interviews.
Okay, great. So let's move on to focus groups then. It is the second core method that we're going to cover today, and I'll follow the same order of topics that we had for the interviews. In other words, we'll talk about when to use them, what instrument development is like for a focus group, things to consider when planning a focus group, and then focus group moderation techniques. So when do you use a focus group in your methods? We talked a few moments ago about how an interview is ideal for talking one-on-one with somebody who's involved in either administering or providing services in a program. A simple way to think of when focus groups are most valuable is on the flip side of that, to talk to consumers, to talk to the participants in a program, to talk to the people that you're trying to affect in a program. From consumers or participants, you want to obtain their thoughts, their opinions, and their experiences with a particular program or initiative. Focus groups are most appropriate when interaction is beneficial and is an explicit goal of your data collection. In other words, getting a small group of people together to share their experiences, to compare and contrast them, to exchange anecdotes and viewpoints and opinions. That's where you want a focus group. They're also a really efficient way to get a lot of information in a single place during a single event. So your instrument, again, a key to a successful focus group is a moderator's guide. That's what we call it. You and other team members will be using that guide. So again, the same kind of care and attention goes into developing it as you would an interview protocol, so that all of you are asking the same questions in the same way and systematically gaining consistent information. So what goes into a guide? It's, again, similar kind of categories as a protocol. There's an introductory section, again, where you talk about who you are and why you're there and what you're going to do with the results of this focus group. I think this is a real opportunity where you start to draw your audience in by telling them how important this data collection is. I always feel like the most valuable information I ever obtain in a project is from a focus group, from the people who are being affected by the program, who are either benefiting from it or not benefiting from it, and why. So I think kind of working that into your discussion of why you're doing the focus group is a good thing in terms of building a nice rapport with the folks you're going to be spending an hour with. You have a section, again, on informed consent, and I would argue that getting high quality informed consent for a focus group of consumers is even more important than getting it from a professional in an interview. You emphasize that this is voluntary, that they can walk away anytime they want, and that it's not going to affect their benefits. You're going to say that, this might not benefit you directly right now, but it's being done in an effort to improve a program. You talk about risks in terms of, I might be asking you questions that are triggering for you, or I can't guarantee that everyone in this group is going to respect the privacy of this group. So, so there are a few more risks associated with a consumer in a focus group than a professional in an interview. So doing a good job with informed consent is really critical. Once you have the consent of folks to participate, then you spend a bit of time talking about ground rules on how a group should be conducting itself. Some of the ground rules are that we're going to take turns. We're going to treat each other with respect by listening to what they have to say and not judging it. That there are no right or wrong answers, so that what one person says might be different from what another person says. And then you really try to drive home the point that what's shared in this group stays in this group, and it's not talked about after we all leave this group. Okay. After the ground rules, then you have your core questions that you want to ask. Again, they should be mapped to the core research questions. They should be arranged in an order that is intuitive and comfortable. They should be open-ended so as to generate discussion. They should not be leading. And here's maybe some good news. The focus group moderator's guide is usually shorter than an interview protocol. You want to have a much smaller number of questions, 10, 15 or so, because you anticipate that you're going to need more time to allow the discussion to occur. Okay, so considerations when you're planning a focus group. On the next slide, please. How many groups do you want to do? Ideally, you want to do more than one, right? One group is one group. If you have 2 or 3, then you can really kind of think about the different things you heard, see how consistent they are, how different they are. How many participants per group? It's kind of a judgment call that different people have different opinions on. For in-person focus groups, we usually aim for 8 to 10. Because even if we have a couple of no-shows, we'll still have 6 or 8 people, and that feels like a comfortable group to manage. For virtual focus groups, though, 4 to 6 is an easier number to manage just because of the complicated logistics of a virtual focus group. How long should a focus group last? In our case, groups tend to last about 90 minutes, but they can be shorter. Either way, you want to build in some time at the front end for setting up the room and for welcoming people as they enter, as well as some time at the end so that you can distribute your incentives and whatnot. So 2 hours is a good bet for your planning purposes. Again, you want to think about language. What language will the group be in? What will be the primary language of the people you're speaking with? And if needed, you want to set aside resources for a bilingual moderator or translation services. Okay, so more things to consider. How will you recruit people for your group? You all are involved in community-based efforts. We like to involve a community group that works with the target population, that is a trusted presence in the community to help us with our recruitment in most cases. Recruitment should not be coercive, and it should also not be targeted in any way that just cherry picks satisfied consumers or successful cases. You want to hear from the full range of participants in a program, from people where the program's working for them as well as those where it's not. Typically, you'll want to offer an incentive. We'll often do a gift card rather than cash. That's a thank you gift. It's a way of recognizing the importance of people's time, and providing food is always a good bet to boost your participation. You'll want to plan for holding a focus group in an appropriate place, a place that is private, that is familiar to the participants, that's convenient as far as access, public transportation, and that's large enough to comfortably hold 10 or so people. That's for in-person groups. If you choose a virtual focus group, There are extra steps you need to take to make sure that the participants have access to the technology and that they also have a private space from wherever they want to participate in a Zoom. And really before that, you'll really want to consider and weigh the pros and cons of in-person versus virtual focus groups. We tend to prefer in-person because the quality of the interaction is better, it's higher, it's more connected. But there is certainly room for virtual focus groups, and they can work very well. If there's a public health problem like COVID going on, obviously, we all shifted to a virtual world in the last several years. But when participants are dispersed across a broad geographic area as well, and they'd have trouble traveling to a central location, that's another good justification for a virtual group. Okay, let me start to wrap up here. I want to talk about our focus group moderation techniques. These again are quite similar to the ones I interviewed, but I think that they're even more challenging to pull off successfully. You're dealing with 8 or 10 people, not just one person sitting across from you. So think about the quality of your introduction. Again, I think I kind of mentioned it earlier that you really want to stress the importance of the focus group and why it's important that we hear from all of you in the group. You go around the room and ask folks to introduce themselves. Here, an icebreaker is critical to get folks loosened up. Usually we come up with a question that asks them to reveal something about themselves. You describe those ground rules that I went over just a moment ago to establish a clear, respectful, and safe tone for everyone to speak and share. Some other things that I've said before, you want to ask crisp and clear and open-ended questions. For focus groups more than interviews, the comfort with silence is critical. Nobody likes it. Everybody wants to fill it. As a moderator, be sure that you're not the one filling those quiet moments with your words and thoughts. Let it percolate up from the group. You might be asking a question that's uncomfortable and might take especially long for somebody to come up with an answer. So let it lay there. It's healthy and good to let it come from the group. Use transitions to walk the group through the protocol. Actively listen. Here again, the challenge is greater because you've got so many people to work with, but eye contact around the group, nodding your head, encouraging people, saying, yep, I understand what you're saying, reflecting things back to the group to make sure you're understanding what they're saying, and work around the group in as natural a way as possible. You want to try to you only have 8 or 10 people there, maybe fewer. You want to make sure you learn something from everybody if you can. Who would like to go next? Thank you, Bridget. What about you, Sophia? And work your way around the group. On the next slide, some more tips, paying attention to nonverbal cues, especially if someone seems to be getting upset or uncomfortable with the discussion and being kind of prepared to address that. Trying to determine who is engaged and who is not by scanning the group as you're working it, looking at everybody, gauging their level of engagement. You want to intentionally try to draw out somebody who seems less engaged. I'm curious about what you're thinking, Zara. See if that'll bring them out. Be ready, try a few times to pull somebody up, but be ready to give it up. Don't be annoying. At some point, if somebody just doesn't want to participate, they don't want them to participate. So you kind of have to judge that situation. And then I guess finally, I would stress that, try to get in the mindset that you are in control. This is your focus group, and you want to use that power to direct the discussion the way you need it to go. For example, every group tends to have a dominating personality, someone who likes to talk and somebody that likes to hear themselves talk. They can be great participants. You can get a ton of information from them, but they can also elbow out others. So politely redirect conversation away from such people. Okay, Bridget, thanks so much. But what about you, Sophia? What do you think? So, very politely but assertively kind of taking control. Sometimes groups get rowdy also. they'll get really involved. A bunch of people will talk at the same time, laughing, whatnot. If that happens, don't be afraid to kind of, again, take control, remind everyone of the ground rules that we all agreed we're going to take turns, and then also point out that we can't hear or catch everything that's being shared if everyone's talking at once. Okay. And then finally, at the end of a group, I think it's really important to take a few moments to stop, take the meeting back to yourself and say, I want to take a few minutes now to review and summarize what you shared with me. It's challenging because you're thinking on your feet, you're on the fly trying to summarize everything you heard. But I think it's a really respectful way to show people that you've listened and you've heard them and you're genuinely interested in whether you got it right. So you summarize it, use your protocol, your moderator's guide and the questions that you asked as a way to organize your thoughts. And then ask at the end, does that sound right? Did I miss anything or did I misunderstand anything? And that's, again, a way to show that you really respect them and what they had to share. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go way over on time, but I'll turn things back to Bridget now.
No, you're good. And I've been chatting just to try to get folks to look in the box folder that we shared. I know I saw Claire's note. This might be the case for others. If you can't get into cloud sharing sites directly into the folder that we shared, we will send the individual files to the folks that are in attendance here after the session, because a lot of those things that Ian mentioned are right there as examples in the instruments, and it's very useful to see them that way. And including the instrument that I'm going to talk about here with observations, I think that's an especially useful one to see the actual guide and example of it, because it can be a little bit challenging to kind of visualize some of these things that might take place in an observation. But I'm going to take it home with a few more slides on the third method, observations. So an observation is exactly what it sounds like. It's watching something happen as an outsider, collecting information on what you're seeing in as objective a way as possible. So you might consider using an observation to collect information on a setting or a process or an interaction between two or more people. And observations use a common instrument to collect the information so that it's as uniform and as systematic as possible, even if different people are using the instrument or it's being applied in different settings. This method can be helpful if you want to compare across settings. For instance, how is an intake process for a public benefits program? How does it happen in a healthcare clinic? How does it happen in a community-based organization? Observing those two different processes using a uniform instrument. It may or may not involve people that are involved in a program that you could be investigating. But the key thing is, if people are involved, program participants are involved, you're not directly collecting perspectives from them. You're not directly questioning them. You're observing what is happening, what they're experiencing, what's happening to them during a process. And finally, in our work, we found that adding observations to other types of data collection can be a relatively light lift. So for instance, if we're already visiting a health clinic to do interviews or focus groups, we might do some observations of a waiting room or the area around the clinic using a structured instrument while we're there. Next slide. When developing an observation instrument, one tip is to use a form or a checklist to make note-taking as easy as possible, because you'll be taking notes while you're observing. Things that you can check off or circle are always good. Here's some examples here, and there are more in that sample that we shared in the file, in the folder. And so that's one tip. Another is that there's a lot of different things that you can look at while you're doing an observation. So really spend time thinking through what you might see and what some of those options would be in a checklist or a form. So when we've observed interior spaces, some of the kind of items that we've looked for have been signage, cleanliness, the shape of the facility, the shape of the things that are in the facility, whether it's crowded, what sort of language, materials on the wall or in handouts are. We've observed observed built or surrounding environments like parking and public transportation? Are there sidewalks, ways for people to get around? Is the building accessible? Is there green space around? Are there other businesses around? And then, of course, observations of individual interactions, like a doctor's visit, could include things like what's reviewed during the visit, how much time, like what is the actual interaction, how long does that take, versus how much waiting time, and is there opportunity for patient questions or discussion? Next slide. And some things to consider when you are planning observations. So first, you want to be as invisible as you can be. We already talked about not asking questions directly. That's a really important one. But another thing is consider using paper and pen rather than a laptop or a tablet. Usually that's a little bit less intrusive and less obvious way to take notes. You may have burning questions that are coming up. Don't ask them. You might be able to get some time with someone that can answer questions about some of the things that you're seeing after the observation. It's always helpful to take pictures with permission, of course, of the places and spaces that you're seeing. We have a rule of thumb: don't take pictures that have a person, a person's face in them. Ideally, no people at all, but definitely not people's face to protect privacy. And this last tip is key. If you are doing something like an observation of an interaction between two or more people, a patient visit or a group care visit, you will need consent from all parties involved. So that's not just the provider. You also would want the patient. If there's multiple patients, you would want an informed consent process for everybody that's going to be involved in that. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our remarks with a little bit of a summary here. So qualitative data is a powerful way to examine both how and why something happens, questions that quantitative data cannot always answer very well or at all, which is why the methods we've shared with you are often paired with quantitative analyses to help explain what's going on behind the numbers. And qualitative data is also really important because it raises the voices of people with lived experience and brings them into program evaluations and process improvement projects. And as I mentioned at the start, if you begin your process with solid research questions, that will help guide your decisions about who you need to collect data from and the methods that you might use. And if you have the resources, you should consider combining multiple qualitative methods, which is called data triangulation, to paint the fullest picture and also get the most detailed response or the most detailed answer that you can to your research question. And then finally, probably can't be said too many times, planning ahead is key, especially if you have IRB review or there's another piece that's going to be added to your timeline. But in general, even if your project doesn't need IRB review, all those different things that Ian went through, especially all those things to consider, it takes time. And so for the best possible results, put the time into planning your data collection methods. All right, we threw a lot at you just now, and that was quick. So we're very interested in your reactions. And so we're going to try out a pretty newish, I would call it, feature on Zoom called Whiteboard. Some of you might be familiar. This is our first time using it at a big group. So we're going to see how it works, or a bigger group. So it's fairly easy to participate. We're going to do a couple instructions here and then launch the whiteboard. You don't have to navigate anywhere when Sophia launches the whiteboard, but it's going to pop up automatically on your screen and take the place of what you see now. We'll present a question and we'll chat the question too, and ask you to create a response in a sticky note. And the sticky notes can be found on the left-hand side of the whiteboard. There's the sixth icon down. It looks like a note, just like the little icon here in the corner. Select it, choose a note color, use your cursor to place your note, and type an answer. It's pretty intuitive, but we can walk you through it again when we launch it. And then you can use as many sticky notes as you want to answer the question. So don't feel like you have to curb how many responses you are giving. And so we're going to launch it now. Okay, so does everybody see it? All right, so I can see people floating around. So yes, you can see. So I should also say that this will be anonymous once you put your sticky note in there. Your names aren't going to be attached to your sticky note. We can see people sort of playing around now. But okay, so our first question is just general. How are you feeling about using the methods that we discussed today? Oh, Sophia already had those ready to go. So there's the first question in English and in Spanish. Okay. Still learning about this methods here. So
Some folks are feeling good about the methods.
good.
Happy with the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, we were trying to figure out if we had time to talk about maybe all three methods, and observations was one that we don't do as often as the others on our team, but that we figured some folks would not have a lot of experience with that and felt important. I see that there's some folks who have had done interviews or done focus groups, but not the other ones.
Could I say something? I like this one comment where it's what someone said, that it feels like a lot of common sense with some good tips and tricks. I wanted to make the overall observation that, one thing you heard in all three of our methods is the importance of the instrument that you use to consistently collect information. It's an instrument for you to really embody what am I trying to learn, and it's an instrument that allows your team to really collect information systematically. There are people out there, and you will run into them, who don't necessarily value qualitative data. They'll say, show me the numbers. The numbers are what are convincing. I would argue that, well, I would disagree 100%. I think qualitative information is extremely valuable, and doing these instruments well is what takes your research beyond being just a bunch of anecdotes and stories to a systematic set of data, even though it's words and narrative and not numbers. So I think that's a helpful observation.
Yeah, I see Lyndon says numbers could be manipulated and feel cold. And it probably came through in kind of some of my remarks, is that, especially in the last, 10 years, I feel like we've been doing more and more mixed methods evaluations that do incorporate both quantitative and qualitative. I'm sure that came through because I talked about the power of those two methods together, because that is, typically our kind of standard approach would be that we'll include a qualitative component, and many of the projects that we work on are purely qualitative, but certainly in a quantitative project that does have some sort of impacts focus, that there would always be a qualitative element paired with it. For that exact reason, Lyndon, to sort of go beyond the numbers, and there's a lot that the quant data can't explain.
And it didn't used to be that. I was just going to say, it didn't used to be that way. 20 years ago, a place like Urban was dominated by economists and numbers crunchers and model builders. And now there's not a single large evaluation that we do that doesn't have both quantitative and qualitative information, because you really can't fully understand the numbers without the story behind them.
So let's do the second question, because I really want to hear that one, the responses to that one too. Sophia, do we need to wipe this or do another one? That is something that actually I did not cover beforehand, I'd like to focus on the answers to the question we're going to ask now.
Yeah.
So we may need to stop and restart for a new question.
Yes, I was going to suggest to just open a different whiteboard so we don't confuse the responses with the different questions. Okay, so I'm going to end this whiteboard.
Hi, you can actually add another page.
Oh, okay. How do I do that?
We're getting trained during the training. Thank you, Christina.
No worries. There's a little page counter on the very bottom right, I think it was, and where it says the 1 in the little square in the little rectangle.
Oh, I see.
Well,
thank you so much.
Yeah,
excellent. Okay, so while we are adding the page and working that out, the second question we have for you is, what ideas are percolating on how you might use qualitative research in your vaccine equity work. So if you have things you're already thinking about, maybe you're already planning, let us know. We're very curious. Or if this may have spurred things that you might do in your vaccine equity work and ways you might incorporate these methods, we'd love to hear about them. And you can feel free to chat them too while we're kind of working this out.
Yeah, I added the second page. Do you see it? I think you might have to click on the little page icon to go to the second page.
I think we're in it now. I
Okay.
clicked on it. Yeah.
Yes, I can see it.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take 1 or 2 minutes to respond here, and then we want to make sure that we get everybody out of here on time. And we have just one more slide for you all too, just on some upcoming events that we want to make sure you know about.
So following up on a survey, I see that idea. That's actually something we do. We might do, we have projects where we do a survey of 500 people, but then we do a sample drawn from that large group to do individual interviews with to get more detailed answers. It's a great idea. Mini stakeholder interviews. Those would be, I'm assuming, briefer interviews than. Mhm.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to cut the whiteboard activity at this point just so that we can wrap up. We just have one more request of you. We do have a satisfaction poll. Many of you have done it before. It's typical for us. We'd like to hear what you thought of the presentations and this training. So if you wouldn't, Sophia's going to launch that in just a second. And if you wouldn't mind doing that satisfaction poll for us. And while you do that, I'm just going to mention a few upcoming events. We have 2 learning sessions happening next week. And the first is that's a Tuesday, May 2nd, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. And that is focused on the end of the public health emergency and what it means for vaccine access. And then following day, Wednesday, May 3rd, we have our reoccurring quarterly learning community member orientation. So if you're new to the learning community, you know other people who are, or if you're just not familiar enough or feel like you aren't, then that would be for you. It is a repeat of previous sessions. So if you've already gone to one of those, you probably don't want to go to that one. And then next, in a few weeks, we have a series of events that we are offering in May, because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so these events all relate to mental health, taking care of yourself, the role of mental health more broadly in public health. So on May 10th, we have a self-care session. It's 30 minutes. It's a mini session, desk yoga for the seated employee. We have another mini session 2 weeks after that on mindfulness. That's also 30 minutes. And slotted in between those, these are all Wednesdays, by the way, slotted in between those, we have our monthly social determinants of health series, and that's at noon on the 17th, May 17th. And the topic for the month of May will be neighborhoods and sleep and health disparities. And our full events calendar is available on our website for those of you who have accessed the website and use it. And that's vaccineequity.urban.org. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Ian, for sharing your expertise with us. Really appreciate it. And we hope to see you all at a future learning session. And we hope this information has been useful. We will share the files with you over email after the session.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye-bye.